The letter landed in the mud at her feet, thrown back with enough force to splatter her dress with dark earth. Harriet Summers stared at it, then lifted her eyes to the man standing in the doorway of the marshal's office, his jaw set like iron, his shoulders blocking the afternoon sun entirely. "I told you to stop sending these," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but in the silence of Caldwell's Main Street, every syllable carried. Marshal Isaac Wren did not move from the doorway. He crossed his arms over his chest, the silver star on his coat catching the light like a blade. "And I told you that I would keep sending them until you gave me a real answer, not the one you wrote in that letter, not the one someone else put in your head." Harriet felt her throat tighten. The paper in the mud was the 9th letter she had returned to him, sealed, unopened. She knew because she had counted every single one, pressing her fingers to the wax until the warmth faded each time, trying to understand why a woman with sense would keep sending back the most earnest words she had ever been offered in her life. "There is no other answer," she said. "You know what I am carrying with me. You know where I come from. You deserve someone who does not bring half the trouble in this territory along with her. Harriet." He stepped off the porch then, and something about the way he said her name made her lungs feel too small. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the deep shadows beneath his gray eyes, the ones that had been there since the night 3 weeks ago when everything in this town had come apart at the seams. "I know exactly what you are carrying. I am the one who rode through the night to make sure you were still alive. I am the one who pulled you out of that burning, do not say it." Her voice cracked. "Do not use that night to argue your case." He was quiet for a moment. Then he crouched down, picked up the letter from the mud and held it out to her, clean side up. "Then open it," he said. "This time just open it." She did not take it. He stood back up, pressed it gently against her hand and walked back inside, letting the door fall shut behind him. Harriet stood alone on the street with his letter in her trembling fingers, and somewhere behind her she heard old Doris Kettner from the dry goods store pretending very hard not to watch. It had all started 3 months ago, in a way that felt so ordinary she had almost missed how extraordinary it would become. She had arrived on the eastbound Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe line at the Caldwell, Kansas depot on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1882, with one travel trunk, a carpet bag, a letter of employment, and a secret she had been keeping so long it had become part of her skeleton. Caldwell was a cattle town, rough and busy and full of men who had not had a bath since the previous decade. And Harriet Summers had taken the position of schoolteacher at the newly constructed one-room schoolhouse on the north end of town, because the previous teacher had left after only 2 months, and because Harriet had absolutely nowhere else to go. She was 26 years old. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a riverboat man who gambled too much and a seamstress mother who worked too hard, and she had put herself through normal school by taking and mending every evening until her fingers bled. She was not fragile. She had never been fragile, but she had made a serious error in judgment 2 years prior in St. Louis, the kind of error that followed a woman like a brand, and when the consequences of that error had come to rest fully on her shoulders in the form of a man named Doyle Fitch, who had decided her reputation was something he could use as leverage, she had packed her life into one trunk and gotten on a train heading west. She had not told anyone in Caldwell about Doyle Fitch, not the school board, not the reverend's wife who managed the boarding house where she took a room, not the young women who tried to befriend her at Sunday services. She told herself it was because there was nothing to tell, that she had done nothing criminal, that the secret was simply a piece of her past that was no longer relevant. She was wrong about that last part. On her first full morning in Caldwell, walking from the boarding house to the schoolhouse to get the room ready before classes began the following week. Harriet had nearly walked directly into Marshal Isaac Wren, who was emerging from the alley beside the grain merchant's building with his deputy, Thomas Lark, and what appeared to be a very disagreeable goat that had been using the alley as a personal dining room. "Morning," Isaac had said, catching her arm before she stumbled. "Watch your step. Caldwell has a complicated relationship with livestock." She had looked up at him. He was tall, broader than the door frames in the boarding house looked like they could accommodate, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and gray eyes that were startlingly clear and direct. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life outdoors and had very few regrets about it. He was, she would later learn, 32 years old and had been Marshal of Caldwell for 4 years, having previously served as a deputy in Wichita and before that as a scout for the Army, work he did not discuss. "Harriet Summers," she had said, "the new school teacher." "Isaac Wren," he had replied, "the person who will find your goat if it ever escapes." She had not found him particularly impressive in that first moment. He had seemed capable and decent, but so had plenty of men who turned out to be otherwise. She had made herself a rule after Doyle Fitch. No entanglements. No trust extended beyond what was strictly necessary. Keep your head down and do your work, and do not let anyone close enough to find the thing you are hiding. The rule lasted approximately 2 weeks. It started because the schoolhouse kept losing its window glass. 3 of the 4 windows had been poorly seated in their frames by the carpenter, and every time the Kansas wind picked up in the evening they rattled so badly the sound could be heard from the main road. Harriet had submitted a repair request to the school board chairman, a large, damp-handed man named Archie Potts, who had responded with a promise he had no intention of keeping. After her 3rd request went unanswered, she had been standing on the schoolhouse step late one afternoon, staring at the rattling east window with an expression that Isaac Wren later told her looked like she was deciding whether to commit arson, when he walked past on his evening rounds. He had stopped. He had looked at the window. He had not asked permission. He had simply gone and retrieved a small toolkit from his office, returned within 10 minutes, and reseated every one of the 4 window panes himself while Harriet stood inside and held the frame steady as he instructed. They had talked the whole time, not about anything that mattered, about Caldwell, about the school board and its chronic uselessness, about the spring drives that would be bringing longhorns up from Texas by the thousands in a few weeks, making the town louder and more dangerous, about the small things that made a place, rather than just a location. When he was finished and the windows no longer rattled, she had made him a cup of coffee on the small stove in the corner of the schoolroom, because it was the only thing she had to offer, and he had sat on one of the small student chairs, which was faintly ridiculous given his size, and drunk it without complaint. She had thought, sitting across from him on another small chair with her own cup, that this was the most at ease she had felt since St. Louis. That thought had frightened her enough that she had kept a careful distance for the following week. He had not seemed to notice the distance, or if he had not remarked on it, which she appreciated more than she would have admitted. He simply continued to cross her path in the natural course of his rounds, to tip his hat, to occasionally stop and say something dry and observant that made her want to laugh even when she was determined not to. He treated her with the same straightforward respect he appeared to extend to everyone who had not yet given him a reason not to, and he never pushed past what she offered. The first time he had come close to the hidden thing was at the beginning of June, when the cattle drives arrived, and Caldwell erupted into the particular chaos that characterized its entire reason for existing. The drovers came in by the hundreds, sun darkened and trail weary and eager to spend the wages they had carried all the way from Texas, and the main street filled with noise and horses, and the thick smell of dust and cattle and cooked meat and whiskey. The schoolteacher's boarding house was on a side street, which muffled most of the worst of it. But one evening a drunk drover had wandered off the main drag and set himself down on the boarding house step, and refused to be moved. Harriet had handled it herself by the time Isaac arrived, having applied a combination of firm words and a face that apparently communicated that she was not a woman to be trifled with, and the drover had relocated to a different step further down the street. Isaac had found her standing in the doorway looking faintly annoyed. "I had it managed," she had told him. "I can see that," he had agreed. "I was coming to check on Mrs. Kettner next door. She gets frightened during drive season." He had paused. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine." "You look like you haven't slept." He had not been wrong. She had not been sleeping well since the drives began, not because of the noise, but because the faces she had been avoiding had started appearing in her dreams, and she had woken twice in a cold terror from a dream in which Doyle Fitch stepped off a cattle train and found her on this very street. She had not told Isaac any of this. "I sleep fine," she had said. He had looked at her for a moment with those clear gray eyes that had a way of seeing past what she said to what she meant, and he had not pressed the point. But the following morning there had been a folded note under the door of the schoolhouse, and it had said only, "If something is troubling you and you would like to talk, I am a reasonable listener. You do not have to. I simply want you to know the door is open. I.W." She had folded the note very small and put it in the bottom of her carpet bag, and told herself it meant nothing. The door had opened further, though she had not meant to open it, on a Sunday afternoon in late June when the whole town was quiet with the specific Sunday quiet that felt different from all other quietness. She had been sitting on the bench outside the schoolhouse, grading the first real batch of papers from her students, and Isaac had come to sit beside her, not on official business, simply because he was there, and she was there, and neither of them had spoken to someone companionable all day. He had brought 2 hard-boiled eggs from the restaurant on Main Street and offered her one, and she had taken it, and they had sat together for an hour in the easy kind of silence that only happens between people who are already comfortable with each other, without quite having realized it yet. He had told her about his mother that afternoon, about how she had come west from Virginia when she was young, had married a farmer in Nebraska, had taught herself to read medicine from a single book, and saved 3 of her neighbor's children from a fever that killed every other child in the surrounding 10 miles. He had talked about her with a quiet pride that had nothing performative about it, and Harriet, listening, had felt something shift behind her ribs. "She sounds extraordinary," she had said. "She was not extraordinary to herself," Isaac had replied. "She just did what needed doing." Harriet had thought about that for a long time afterward. She had told him about her mother that same afternoon, about the seamstress who worked until midnight by lamplight without complaint, about the precision of her stitches, and the way she had pressed her fingers to every finished garment as if blessing it before it left her hands. She had not told him about her father's gambling, about the debts, about the way the family had contracted and contracted until there was almost nothing left of it. She had not told him about Doyle Fitch. But she had told him about her mother, and that was more than she had told anyone in 2 years. And when she walked back to the boarding house that evening, she had pressed her hand flat against her sternum, as if she could physically hold the feeling in place. The trouble had arrived with the mail on the 14th of July. She had known it was from him before she opened it, because of the handwriting. Doyle Fitch had a distinctive hand, large and assertive, the kind of handwriting that took up more space on the page than it needed to, that leaned forward aggressively. She had stood in the foyer of the boarding house with the envelope in her hands and the floor tilting slightly under her feet, and she had made herself breathe before she opened it. He had found her. The letter was brief and cordial in the way that a trap dressed up as a flower arrangement is cordial. He mentioned that he was in good health. He mentioned that he had heard she was teaching school in Caldwell, and that he hoped she was finding the West suited her temperament. He mentioned that he had recently been in conversation with several prominent men in St. Louis regarding certain events from 2 years prior, and that he felt it would be a pity if the full context of those events were to find their way into the wrong ears. He signed it with fond regards. The full context, as Doyle Fitch presented it, was this. 2 years ago in St. Louis, Harriet had been employed as a schoolteacher at a small private academy. Doyle Fitch had been a trustee of that academy and the son of one of its primary benefactors. He had decided that Harriet's intelligence and her directness, and the precise way she held herself, were interesting to him, and he had made advances that she had declined, politely at first and then with increasing firmness. When she continued to decline, he had accused her in writing to the Academy Board of financial impropriety, of taking money from the school funds. The accusation was entirely fabricated. Harriet had no access to school funds. But Doyle Fitch had the trust of the board and the weight of his family's money behind him, and an investigation had been opened. And though nothing had ever been proven because there was nothing to prove, the mud of the accusation had stuck, and she had lost her position. She had not fought back. She had been 24 and alone and frightened, and she had simply taken the first position she could find that was far enough away from St. Louis that his reach would not follow her. She had told herself she was running away. She had also told herself that survival was not cowardice, and she went back and forth between those two positions depending on the day. Now his reach had extended to Caldwell, and he wanted something. The letter did not say what. It implied that further communication would be forthcoming. It implied that her cooperation would determine the nature of his next move. She had spent 3 days trying to decide what to do about it, during which she had been so distracted and short-tempered in the classroom that her students had looked at her with the specific confusion children reserve for adults who are behaving in ways they cannot account for. On the 4th day, passing Isaac on the main road during his morning rounds, she had looked up at him and said, without planning to, "I have received a threatening letter and I do not know what to do." He had stopped walking. He had looked at her carefully. He had said, "Would you like to tell me about it?" She had said, "Not yet." He had nodded, and that was all, and they had continued walking in their respective directions. But that evening he had left another folded note under the schoolhouse door that read, "Whenever you are ready. There is no rush, but you are not alone. IW." She had pressed her fingers to that one too before she folded it away. 2 more letters arrived from Doyle Fitch over the following 3 weeks. The second was less cordial. He made a clearer suggestion that he intended to contact the Caldwell School Board directly with the St. Louis story if she did not write back with what he called a more accommodating response. The third was openly hostile. He told her that she had made a fool of him once and would not do so again, and that he had friends in Caldwell who could confirm her presence there, which meant he had been making inquiries, which meant this was not going to stop on its own. It was the third letter that broke her open. She had gone to find Isaac that evening, not at the Marshal's office but at his house, a small, clean-frame house on the edge of town that she had walked past 100 times and never stopped at before. She had knocked and he had answered, and she had handed him the 3 letters without saying anything, and he had stood in the doorway reading all 3 of them with an expression that went from attentive to very still. "Come inside," he said. I'll make coffee. She had told him everything. All of it. St. Louis and the academy and the accusation and the flight to Caldwell and the year and a half of convincing herself she had outrun it. She had told him everything with her hands folded very tightly in her lap and her eyes fixed on the pattern of the kitchen tablecloth. And when she was finished, she had looked up, and he was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "He fabricated evidence against you," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Because you refused him." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Harriet, I want to be very clear about something. What you are describing is not something you caused and not something you deserve to be managing alone. And Doyle Fitch threatening you by mail is not a personal matter I am going to stand to the side of." "You cannot arrest a man for writing letters," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I can write a letter of my own." He had picked up the 3 envelopes and aligned them neatly on the table. "I am going to contact the St. Louis Marshal's office and request any documentation they have on Fitch. I am also going to write directly to him as Marshal of this county, making it very clear that any further contact with you constitutes harassment and that his correspondence will be retained as evidence." She had stared at him. "That may make it worse." "It may," he said. "But it will make it known that you are not isolated. That changes the calculation for men like him." She had not cried. She was not a woman who cried easily. But something in her chest had loosened in a way that was almost physical, like a knot coming undone. And she had looked at Isaac Wren in his kitchen with his coffee and his steady gray eyes, and the very careful way he was respecting the distance she had kept without being asked to. And she had thought, "This man is different." The thought had scared her badly enough that she had gone home shortly after, and for the following week she had pulled her careful distance back around herself like a coat. He had let her do it. That was the thing about Isaac Wren that kept disarming her. He never pushed. He never crowded. He extended his hand, and if she did not take it, he simply kept his hand extended, patient as stone, without making her feel guilty about not taking it. Most men she had known treated patience as a strategy, something you performed until the other person's defenses came down, and then you struck. Isaac performed nothing. He simply was what he was consistently and left it up to her what to do with that. His letter to Doyle Fitch had been sent. The reply from the St. Louis Marshal's office had come back with information that made Isaac's jaw set in the hard way that meant he was very angry very quietly, which Harriet had by then learned to distinguish from his ordinary expression. It turned out that Harriet was not the first woman Doyle Fitch had made accusations against. There had been 2 others in St. Louis, both of whom had declined his attentions, both of whom had found themselves on the receiving end of similar fabricated allegations. One had left the city. The other had stayed and fought and been made sufficiently miserable that she had eventually left too. There were no official charges against Fitch because his family's money had a way of making official processes bend in his direction. But the Marshal's office had the documentation, and Isaac had it now. He had come to the schoolhouse on the afternoon he received this information. He had knocked on the door during the lunch hour when the children were outside, and he had laid the documents on her desk, and he had told her what they said. "He has done this before," she said. "At least twice that's documented," Isaac said. "Probably more." She had looked at the papers for a long time. Then she had said, "I am not special to him. I am just the next one." "That is correct," Isaac said, "which means you have nothing to be ashamed of, which means you have never had anything to be ashamed of." She had not cried then either, but it had been very close. The situation with Fitch had remained at a simmer through August. No new letters had arrived from him. which Isaac said likely meant the official letter from the Marshal's office had temporarily backed him off, but which Isaac also said, with the particular directness she had come to rely on, probably did not mean he had given up entirely. Men like Doyle Fitch did not accept being thwarted gracefully. They circled and waited and came back from a different angle, which was why it had happened in late August, on a Wednesday night, the night that had shattered the careful, slow thing that had been building between Harriet and Isaac, and then remade it into something that could not be taken back. The building that served as the town's secondary stable on the west end of the main street was set on fire at 10:30 in the evening. It was not an accident. The town's night watchman, a gray, bearded man named Clarence who had held the position for 11 years, had been struck from behind and left unconscious in the alley beside the dry goods store, which meant whoever had set the fire had planned it. The stable itself was empty of horses. They had been moved to the primary stable that afternoon for some farrier work, and so no animals were lost, but the building went up fast and hot. What was in the building, in a locked room at the back that was used for storing documents and equipment by the deputy marshal's office, was a locked strongbox containing the correspondence from the St. Louis marshal's office regarding Doyle Fitch, along with 2 depositions from the women in St. Louis that the office had sent at Isaac's request, documents that would have been considerable ammunition for any formal proceedings against Fitch. It was Thomas Lark, Isaac's young deputy, who first noticed where Harriet was when the fire started. She had been at the boarding house. Everyone at the boarding house could confirm that, but Thomas had gone to find her immediately because he had remembered that she sometimes went to the locked room to use the writing desk there in the evenings, as Isaac had given her use of it when the boarding house got too loud during drive season. It was Thomas who ran to the boarding house and pounded on the door and found Harriet already dressed because the smell of smoke had woken half the town. And it was Isaac who, upon being told by Thomas where the documents were kept, had looked across the crowd of people watching the building burn and found Harriet's face in the firelight. He had crossed the distance between them in a few strides. He had taken her by the arm and said, "Where have you been the last hour? In bed," she said. "The smoke woke me." "Isaac, the documents." "I know about the documents," he said. "Are you all right? Are you unhurt?" "Yes, I stay with Mrs. Kettner," he said. "Stay in the crowd and do not go anywhere alone." She had understood then. The fire had not been an accident, and if the documents were the target, then someone had known about those documents, and if someone had known about those documents, then someone had been watching her, watching this, long enough to know where she kept things. They had not slept that night. By 2 in the morning the fire was out and what remained of the building was a charred shell, and the strong box had been pulled from the wreckage, the metal warped but intact, and Isaac, with considerable effort, had opened it to find that the depositions and the correspondence were damaged but readable. The fire had not managed to destroy them entirely. It was in the aftermath of that discovery, with the whole town quieting and the orange glow dying and Harriet sitting on the step of the marshal's office, wrapped in a shawl Mrs. Kettner had brought her that something cracked open in the careful composition of Isaac Wren. He had come to sit beside her on the step, and he had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said very quietly, "I was afraid tonight." She had looked at him. "For the documents, no," he said. "For you." He had looked straight ahead at the dying glow. "When Thomas said you might have been in that building, I stopped thinking clearly for about 30 seconds, which has not happened to me since I was 18 years old and significantly stupider." Harriet had looked at his profile, the strong jaw and the lines at the corners of his eyes and the way the ember light moved across him, and she had said, "I was not in the building. I know that now." He had turned to look at her then, and in his gray eyes was something she had never seen there before, or perhaps had seen there all along but refused to acknowledge. "Harriet, I think you already know what I want to say to you. And I understand if the timing is terrible and if you are not in a position to hear it. But if I do not say it now, I am going to be saying it for the rest of my life to myself in the dark, and that seems like a poor way to live." She had felt her heart going very fast. She had said, "Isaac, I have a lot of respect for the distance you have kept," he said, "and I have tried to honor it, but I would very much like to stop honoring it if you will let me." She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said, "I am not a simple proposition, you know that." "I know it," he said. "I do not want a simple proposition." She had taken a very long breath. Then she had said the most honest thing she had said to anyone in 2 years. "I think I feel the same way, and that terrifies me, because the last time I trusted someone it cost me everything." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to trust me completely and immediately. I am asking you to let me try." She had not answered that night. She had gone back to the boarding house, and she had lain in bed and stared at the ceiling for the remainder of the night, and tried to locate the fear in her chest to determine its exact dimensions, because fear she could not see clearly was fear that controlled her, and she had been controlled by enough things. The investigation into the arson had moved quickly. Thomas Lark, who was young but observant, had noticed a man lingering near the stable before sunset whom he did not recognize. The description had been sent to the Wichita Marshal's office, and the response had come back within the week with a name. The man was a Fitch associate, a hired hand named Cole Varney, who did various disagreeable things for money, and who had been in Wichita only recently, where Doyle Fitch was known to have business interests. It was not enough for an arrest, but it was enough for Isaac to make another contact with the St. Louis office and with the Wichita Marshal's office simultaneously, informing them of the arson, of its clear connection to the harassment campaign against Harriet, and of the documented pattern of Doyle Fitch's behavior. He had also sent a second letter directly to Fitch himself, this one considerably less cordial than the first, informing him that the evidence had not been destroyed, that the law was watching, and that his next move in this direction would have serious legal consequences. Fitch had responded. Not to Isaac, but to Harriet. A letter had arrived at the boarding house at the end of August, and this one had dropped all pretense. He told her she had made an enemy of him, and that she would regret the interference of local law enforcement in what was a private matter between them. He told her that the school board in Caldwell would soon be receiving a very detailed account of her conduct in St. Louis, and that no small town marshal would be able to prevent that. Harriet had read the letter once, folded it, and gone directly to Isaac's office. She had laid it on his desk and stood on the other side of the desk while he read it, and when he finished and looked up at her, she had said, "I want to fight back." Something in his face had changed. "Tell me what that looks like to you," he said. "I want to go to the school board here before he does," she said. "I want to tell them the truth, not Fitch's version, the actual truth with the documentation from St. Louis. I want them to hear it from me first so that, when his letter arrives, it does not land on ground he has already prepared." Isaac had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had said, "That is the right call." She had gone to the school board the following Monday morning with Isaac beside her at her request, and she had told them. She had told them about the academy, about Fitch, about the accusation and its complete fabrication, and she had given them the copies of the St. Louis documentation that Isaac had made. Archie Potts had listened with his large, damp hands folded on the table and an expression of cautious deliberation, and the two other board members had exchanged glances that she could not entirely interpret. and at the end of her account, there had been a silence that felt very long. It was the third board member, a woman named Clara Ashe, who had been the most skeptical of hiring Harriet in the first place, who had spoken first. "I have seen 2 letters from your students' families this past month," Clara said, "both of them commending the quality of instruction their children have received this term. I suggest we allow Miss Summers to continue her work until such time as there is any actual evidence of misconduct, which I am prepared to wager there will not be." Archie Potts had agreed, with somewhat less grace, but he had agreed. Doyle Fitch's letter had arrived at Archie Potts's home 12 days later. Potts had come to Harriet with it, in what she suspected was a combination of duty and personal discomfort, and he had told her it had arrived, and she had thanked him and told him she was not surprised, and he had gone away looking as though he would have preferred this to be someone else's problem, which was fair enough. The letter had made no difference to the school board, but it had made a difference to certain factions of the town who had a taste for other people's difficulties. And for the following 2 weeks, Harriet had endured a set of social whispers that were familiar and awful, women at Sunday services stepping back slightly when she approached, invitations to tea that were not extended. She had moved through it with her chin level, and her face composed, and told herself it was the same as it had been in St. Louis and she had survived that. But it was different in Caldwell. Because Isaac was here, he had not made a scene. He had not done anything dramatic or publicly demonstrative. What he had done was continue to be seen speaking with her, eating at the same table at the restaurant, sitting beside her at Sunday services without apparent concern for what anyone thought. It was the quiet, consistent, daily declaration of a man who had decided where he stood and was not interested in moving. Several people who had been cooling toward Harriet, noting the Marshal's position on the matter, had warmed back considerably. Thomas Lark had told her, with the cheerful disregard for tact that characterized him, that Isaac had gone to Archie Potts privately, and told him that if the school board acted against Harriet on the basis of Fitch's letter before any actual evidence of wrongdoing materialized, the Marshal's office would be looking very closely at the conditions under which Potts had awarded the contract for the new livery stable to his cousin. Thomas had thought this was extremely funny. Harriet had thought about it for a long time. It was during this period, the 2 weeks of whispers, that Isaac had written her the first letter. It had arrived at the boarding house with the regular morning mail, in an envelope addressed in his handwriting, which she recognized because she had seen enough official correspondence from his office to know it. She had opened it in her room before the school day, and she had read it standing by the window with the early light coming in. He had not said anything about Fitch. He had not said anything about the school board or the social whispers or any of the immediate difficulties. He had written about a morning he had ridden out to the Arkansas River before dawn, when the water was low and the banks were quiet, and how the light came across the prairie in a particular way in early September that was different from all other times of year, and how the grass moved in the wind, and how the whole thing had made him think of her. He had written that he was not sure what that connection meant, or why the prairie light specifically had made him think of her, only that it had, and that he was writing it down because he found he wanted her to know what he was thinking about. He had not asked anything of her. He had simply sent the thing he was thinking. She had folded the letter and put it in the bottom of her carpetbag with the note he had written about being a reasonable listener, and she had gone to school. On the third day, she had been sitting at her desk in the evening after the school day was done, with the light turning amber through the new window panes, and she had written back. She had not planned to. She had simply found herself with pen in hand and the letter in front of her, and had written that she had walked past the grain merchant's alley that morning and a goat had been watching her from the shadows, and that she had told it good morning, and that it had regarded her with approximately the level of respect she deserved, which was moderate at best, and that she had laughed about it the rest of the way to the schoolhouse. She had sent the letter to his office, and immediately felt that she had made an error in judgment of some kind, though she could not precisely identify what kind. His next letter had arrived 2 days later. It was longer than the first. He wrote about the town in the early morning when the drovers were still sleeping, and the main street was quiet, about the specific quality of the silence. He wrote about a conversation he had with Thomas Lark's grandmother, a small Cherokee woman named Ada who sold herbs from the back of a wagon on the edge of town, and who had told him, in extremely direct terms, that he was too serious for his own good, and that this condition was curable if he was willing to apply some effort. Harriet had laughed at that paragraph. She had written back the same evening, a longer letter than the previous one, and this time she had written about her students, about the way a boy named Peter Holloway, who was 10 years old and possessed of a magnificent stubbornness, had finally broken through to an understanding of long division after 3 weeks of apparent impenetrability, and the expression on his face when the numbers had suddenly made sense had been one of the finest things she had witnessed in 2 years of teaching. And so they had carried on, letter by letter, while also seeing each other in person, while also navigating the ongoing tension of Doyle Fitch's presence in the background of their lives. They had built something on paper that was intimate in a way that face-to-face conversation sometimes was not, because paper removed the self-consciousness, removed the need to manage expression and distance, and the fear of being seen too clearly. She had almost told him she loved him, not in words that direct, but in the pattern of what she wrote, in the things she chose to tell him about, in the things she asked him. She had written once, in a letter sent in October when the autumn had begun to change the light, that she was afraid not of Doyle Fitch and not of the school board, and not of any of the practical difficulties, but of the specific vulnerability of caring about a person in a place where she had not expected to care about anyone. His response to that had been a single paragraph that she had read 7 times. He had written, "I understand that kind of fear. I carried a version of it for years, after the things I saw doing army work in the territories, things I will tell you about someday when the right time comes. What I came to understand was that the fear was not a reason to close. It was a sign that something worth protecting had grown in a place that had been empty for a long time. Worth protecting does not mean it will not hurt you. It means it is worth the hurt." She had read those sentences 7 times, and on the 8th time she had folded the letter and pressed it to her sternum, the full flat of her palm, and held it there for quite a long time. And then Doyle Fitch had done something she had not anticipated. He had come to Caldwell himself. He had arrived on the Wednesday morning train at the beginning of October, and Harriet had not known he was there until she arrived at school and found a note pinned to the schoolhouse door, in his assertive handwriting, informing her that he was at the hotel on Main Street and would like very much to discuss the situation between them in a civilized manner. She had taken the note directly to Isaac without going inside the schoolhouse. She had stood in the doorway of his office and held it out and said, "He is here. He is at the hotel." Isaac had taken the note, read it, and stood up from his desk in one smooth motion. "Go to the schoolhouse," he said. "Lock the door. I will come to you." She had not gone to the schoolhouse. She had followed him to the hotel, which she suspected he knew she would do, and chose not to argue about because it was a morning of sufficient urgency not to waste time on that particular negotiation. He had gone into the hotel and come out 5 minutes later looking as though he had said something that had not been received pleasantly. Fitch had been in the lobby. He was a well-dressed man in his mid-30s with a handsome face arranged in a permanently aggrieved expression, and he had come outside onto the hotel step and looked at Harriet with a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Miss Summers," he had said, "you are looking well for a woman living in quite so much dust." "Mr. Fitch," Isaac said, positioning himself with the particular casual deliberateness that Harriet had learned meant he was prepared for a range of possible outcomes. "I have explained to you inside that you are on notice. I am now explaining it to you outside. Any approach to Miss Summers that she has not invited is not going to go well for you." "I am simply here to have a conversation," Fitch had said. "She does not want a conversation with you," Isaac said. "With respect, Marshal, that is not your decision to make." "Harriet," Isaac said without looking away from Fitch, "would you like to speak to this man?" "No," she said clearly. "There is your answer," Isaac said. "I am going to suggest you take the next train back to Wichita or St. Louis, or wherever you are comfortable. And I am going to further suggest that if you contact Miss Summers again in any form, I will be sending the complete file on your activities to the Federal Marshal's office in Topeka, which, given the interstate nature of this harassment, is entirely within my jurisdiction to do." Doyle Fitch had looked at Isaac for a long moment with an expression of concentrated dislike. Then he had looked at Harriet and said quietly, so that only the three of them could hear it, "You have made yourself an obstacle to a man who does not tolerate obstacles, Miss Summers. I hope your Marshal friend understands what he has involved himself in." "He does," Isaac said. "Go back inside, Fitch." Fitch had gone back inside. He had taken the evening train out of Caldwell. Thomas Lark had confirmed his departure personally, watching the platform from a distance until the train pulled away. Isaac had sent the complete file to the Federal Marshal's office in Topeka that same afternoon, as promised. He had also, that same evening, after the adrenaline of the day had subsided to something quieter, and Harriet was sitting in the Marshal's office waiting to be told everything was fully managed, sat across from her and said, "Are you all right?" She had thought about it seriously. "I think so," she said. "I think it is not over. Men like him do not get on trains and give up." "No," he said honestly, "but the federal office has the file now, and that changes what he is risking. He is not rational enough to be stopped by decency, but he is rational enough to be stopped by consequences." She had looked at him. "You have been managing this for months," she said. "You have had it as a weight on your office and your time and your attention. And you have not once indicated that you found it a burden." "I do not find it a burden," he said. "Isaac, Harriet," she had taken a breath. "Why are you doing all of this?" He had looked at her steadily. "You know why." She had looked back at him for a long moment. Then she had stood up and picked up her coat from the chair and said, "I am going to write you a letter tonight." "I will look forward to it," he said. The letter she had written that night had been the most honest thing she had ever put on paper. She had told him that she was afraid, and that she was tired of letting the fear make her decisions for her. She had told him that she had been running for 2 years, and that Caldwell was the first place she had stopped running. And she wanted to understand whether that was about the place or about him, or whether the two had become so intertwined that distinguishing between them was no longer possible or necessary. She had told him that she thought about him in the early mornings when the light came through the boarding house window in a particular way, that she thought about his letters, that she thought about the window glass and the egg and the Sunday bench, and all the small ordinary moments that had accumulated into something she did not have a clean word for, but which felt very much like home. She had sent it in the morning and spent the school day in a state of complicated suspension. His response had arrived at the boarding house by late afternoon, which meant he had written it immediately. She had taken it upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and opened it. He had written that he loved her, not obliquely, not with hedging or qualification. He had written it plainly and directly, "I love you." He had written that he did not expect her to say the same thing back, that he was not writing it as a demand but as a declaration, because she deserved to know exactly where he stood. He had written that if she wanted to continue the exchange of letters and the Sunday afternoons and the coffee in the schoolroom and all the incremental closeness, until she felt ready for something more defined, he would do that happily for as long as she needed. He had written that he was not going anywhere. Harriet had read the letter 3 times, and then she had gone to the boarding house window and looked out at the main street of Caldwell, and thought that the trouble with being loved by someone who did not push was that eventually the only person keeping you at a distance was yourself. She had done something she could not entirely account for at the time. She had sealed the letter back in its envelope, written his name on the front in her own hand, and put it in the outgoing mail basket in the front hall. She had sent it back to him unopened, not because she did not want it, but because she was not ready to accept it, and because she was ashamed of not being ready, and because shame made her angry, and because she had acted on the anger before she could stop herself. His response had arrived the following morning. Another letter, this one shorter. He did not mention the returned letter except in a single sentence at the beginning that said, "You sent it back, so I am sending it back to you, because what I wrote is still true." The rest of the letter was about a thunderstorm he had ridden through that morning on his way back from investigating a fence dispute 3 miles south of town, about the specific smell of rain on the Kansas prairie, which was different from rain anywhere else he had been, and how in the middle of the storm he had thought it was the most alive he had felt in years. She had sent the letter back again. He had sent it back a 3rd time with a brief addition at the bottom. "I will keep sending this until you are ready to keep it." She had sent it back a 4th time. He had sent it back a 5th with a note that said only, "Still true." This had continued for 2.5 weeks, back and forth, and each time the letter returned to her she had held it longer before sending it back, pressing her fingers to the seal the way her mother used to press her fingers to finished garments, as if she could communicate something through the touch. It was the 7th return that had broken her open. She had received it back from him with a new line added at the bottom that read, "Harriet, I am not going to pretend this is not exactly what it is. I am not going to stop sending this back to you, and I am not going to stop being here. Whatever you are working through, you do not have to work it through alone. But I need you to know that this letter will keep coming back because what it says is permanent, and some things should not be hidden just because they are frightening." She had sat with it for 3 days. And then she had not sent it back, but she had written a new letter, and the new letter had said, "I am afraid that if I accept what you are offering and it goes wrong, there will be nothing left of this place for me. I am afraid I will have to run again, and I am very, very tired of running." He had been at the boarding house within the hour, not with a letter, in person. He had knocked on the front door, and Mrs. Kettner, the Reverend's wife who ran the boarding house, had called up the stairs, and Harriet had come down to find him standing in the entryway holding his hat in his hands in the way men held their hats when they were being very careful not to appear threatening. "I am not going to let it go wrong," he had said. "You cannot guarantee that," she said. "No," he said. "But I can tell you that whatever difficulty comes, you will not face it alone. Not again. That much I can guarantee." She had stood at the foot of the boarding house stairs with Mrs. Kettner making considerable noise in the kitchen in a way that did not fool anyone, and she had looked at Isaac Wren standing in the entryway with his hat in his hands, and she had thought that this man had returned 9 letters without complaint, had chased off Doyle Fitch, had sat beside her in the dark after the fire, had written about prairie light because it made him think of her, had told her he loved her plainly and waited without pressure for her to find her way to it. She had crossed the entryway, closed the distance she had been maintaining for 4 months, taken his face in her hands and kissed him. He had stayed very still for 1 second, as if he needed to be certain it was real, and then his arms had come around her, and he had held her with the steadiness that was the most essential thing about him, the specific solidity of a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. And she had felt the walls come down with a quietness that surprised her, not with a crash but with a simple, complete release. Mrs. Kettner had appeared in the kitchen doorway shortly after, assessed the situation and said, "I will put coffee on," and disappeared again. The following weeks had been, not without difficulty, because Doyle Fitch had not in fact disappeared, but the difficulty had changed shape. In late October, the federal marshal's office in Topeka had contacted Isaac with information that Fitch was under preliminary investigation for fraud and misappropriation of funds related to his family's business interests, connected to other complaints that had predated Harriet's situation. The information was not public, but it meant that Fitch's ability to cause trouble for Harriet was shrinking. The investigation constrained him. He was not going to move against a Kansas schoolteacher when federal marshals were reviewing his financial records. Isaac had told Harriet about this carefully, not as a reason for her to let her guard down entirely, but as a genuine change in the situation. She had listened, and then she had asked, "Do you think it is over?" "I think the acute danger is past," he said. "I think we watch and we document and we do not assume, but I think the worst of it is behind you." She had taken a long breath. "Behind us," she said. He had looked at her at that, the slight shift in his expression that she had come to know as the version of happiness that looked like surprise, and he had said, "Behind us." The autumn had deepened, and the cattle drives had slowed and Caldwell had settled into its winter pace, which was quieter and more intimate, the community drawing together against the cold in the way communities did in places where winters had teeth. Harriet's second term with the school had been without incident from the board, and the families who had cooled toward her had largely warmed back, partly from Isaac's visible regard for her and partly because her students came home with improving marks and a genuine enthusiasm for school that several parents had commented on as something they had not expected. Isaac had taken to walking her to and from the schoolhouse in the mornings and evenings, and while this was the subject of considerable Caldwell commentary, she had stopped caring about Caldwell commentary, which was itself a measure of how much had changed. They walked and talked, and the walking and talking had become one of the fixed points of her day, the thing she oriented toward. He had asked her to marry him on a morning in late November, not dramatically, not on his knee in the middle of the main street with an audience, which she later told him would have prompted her to decline purely on principle. He had asked her while they were walking along the edge of the south field beyond the schoolhouse, where the land went flat and wide, and the winter sky came down enormous and blue, and he had simply said, with the plainness that was characteristic of him in the things that mattered most, "I want to marry you, Harriet." "Will you?" She had stopped walking. She had looked at the sky and the field and the man beside her, and she had thought that the woman who had arrived on the Atchison-Topeka and Santa Fe line with a carpet bag and a secret and a rule about entanglements would not recognize herself in this moment, and that this was perhaps the finest thing she could say about the past 7 months. "Yes," she said, "I will." He had taken her hand and held it without letting go for the remainder of the walk, and when they reached the schoolhouse she had turned to go inside and he had said, "Harriet." She had turned back. He had kissed her in the morning light outside the schoolhouse, with the winter sky enormous above them, and the prairie going on forever in every direction. And she had kissed him back with the full weight of everything she had been carrying for 2 years finally set down. They were married in December, just before Christmas, in the small church at the center of Caldwell, on a day when the temperature was bitter and the sky was the deep clear blue that only came with real cold. Mrs. Kettner had made alterations to Harriet's green woolen dress and contributed a length of ivory ribbon that she declared was appropriate even if it was not traditional. Thomas Lark had stood as witness with an expression of enormous self-satisfaction at having been correct in his prediction of the outcome, which he had apparently been making since approximately the second month of Harriet's time in Caldwell. Ada, Thomas's grandmother, had come to the church and presented Harriet with a small bundle of dried herbs that she said were for happiness and persistence in equal measure, both of which Harriet would need. And Ada had looked at Isaac with the expression of a woman who found him somewhat less incorrigibly serious than she had previously assessed, which was the highest available praise from Ada. Isaac had looked at Harriet during the ceremony with an expression that she filed away in her memory carefully, intending to keep it there for the rest of her life. When the Reverend pronounced them married, he had said her name once quietly, just her name, and the way he said it held everything that did not need words. The winter settled over them fully then, and it was the best winter of Harriet's adult life. She remained teaching through the winter term. It had never been suggested by either of them that her teaching was something she should give up in favor of domesticity, partly because Harriet would have had a specific set of words for that suggestion, and partly because Isaac had said, early in their courtship, that her teaching was a thing she was clearly made for, and that anyone who proposed to ask her to stop it would be making a serious error in judgment. The school board had reappointed her for the following year without discussion. She moved her things from the boarding house to Isaac's house, which was small and clean, and became something different once she was in it. She brought books, of which she had more than the single room could comfortably accommodate, and Isaac built her a second set of shelves along the wall of the front room without being asked, which she found absurdly moving. She put the carpet bag in the wardrobe, the one that contained his earliest notes and the letters they had exchanged, and she kept it there deliberately, because it was a record of what it had taken to get here, and she did not want to forget that record. The federal investigation into Doyle Fitch had progressed through the winter. In February, word reached Isaac through the Topeka office that Fitch had been formally charged with fraud and misrepresentation in a case involving several families in St. Louis from whom he had taken investments under false pretenses. The charges included the testimony of multiple women whose accounts of his conduct toward them, compiled through the work of the federal office, had established a pattern. Isaac had told Harriet the news carefully, watching her face as he told it. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "The other women. The two in St. Louis. What happens to them?" "Their names are cleared," Isaac said. The documentation in the federal case makes it explicit that the accusations against them were fabricated. Harriet had let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 2 years. Then she had gone to the front room and stood with her hand on the mantel for a little while, and Isaac had let her stand there, understanding without being told that this was a moment that needed to be stood in. When she had turned back, her eyes were bright, not with tears but with something clearer than that. "I want to write to them," she said. "The other women. I do not know their names, but if the federal office has them as witnesses, they must have addresses." "I can get the information through the office," Isaac said. "I want to write to them," she said again. "Just to say that it is over, that someone believed them. I think someone should say that." "I think you are right," he said. She had written 2 letters, carefully worded, one to each of the women, through the federal office as intermediary. One had written back within a few weeks, a brief letter full of the specific relief of someone who had been told something they had been waiting a long time to hear. The other had not written back, but Isaac told Harriet that the silence did not mean the letter had not mattered. Spring came back to Caldwell the way it came to the Kansas prairie, suddenly and with extravagance, the winter giving way almost overnight to an overwhelming green and wind, and the enormous sky opening up, as if it had been folded away all season, and was now being let out to its full size. Harriet watched it from the schoolhouse windows, the new windows that sat perfectly in their frames because Isaac had seated them properly the previous May, and she thought that the woman who had arrived on this same train platform 12 months ago would not have believed this spring was possible. She had told Isaac, one evening in April, that she was going to have a baby. She had told him in the kitchen of their small house, where he was repairing a chair rung with the focused attention he brought to small practical tasks, and he had set the chair down very carefully, and then sat there for a moment saying nothing. "Isaac," she said, when the silence had gone on long enough to be interpretable several ways and she was not sure which way, he had looked up at her. His face was doing the thing where the emotion was too large to have a single name. He had said, "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. The doctor confirmed it this morning. He estimates late October or early November. Isaac had stood up. He had crossed the kitchen, and he had held her face in his hands very gently, and he had said, "I have been hoping for this," and his voice had been so quiet and sincere that she had to close her eyes for a moment. "You might have said so," she said, her voice a little unsteady. "I did not want to put pressure on the situation," he said. "Given that we are talking about the entirely private biological process of another human being." She had laughed at that, actually laughed, and he had put his arms around her, and she had felt him press his mouth to the top of her head, and they had stood there in the kitchen while the April evening came in through the windows, and the chair rung waited patiently on the floor. The summer of 1883 was a good one. Harriet taught through the spring term with the school board's full support and arranged for a temporary replacement for the fall. A young woman from Wichita who was more than capable, and who Harriet spent the summer preparing with the specific thoroughness that characterized her approach to things that mattered. The cattle drives brought their usual chaos to Caldwell's Main Street, and Isaac managed them with the steady competence that had made his name in the county. And Thomas Lark continued to develop into a genuine deputy, rather than simply a young man with a badge. A development in which Ada's direct counsel played a role that Thomas both acknowledged and was embarrassed about. Isaac had told Harriet about the army work that summer, the things he had said he would tell her someday. "Is that why you left?" she said. It was not exactly a question. "Partly," he said. "Partly because I met a man in the Wichita Marshal's office who seemed to be doing work that was more directly useful, and I thought I might be suited to it." He paused. "The army work is something I carry. I do not think it goes away, but I think I understand it differently now than I did at the time." She had taken his hand. "The injustice of it," she said carefully. "What was done to those people, that is not something that goes away either for them." "No," he said quietly. "It is not. And that is something I think about." She had held his hand, and they had sat with the weight of that for a while, because some things deserved to be sat with, and because the woman who had grown up watching her mother press her fingers to finished garments had always understood that acknowledgement was a form of respect. The baby came in late October, right at the edge of the doctor's estimate, and it was a boy. He arrived with considerable determination at 3 in the morning while Isaac sat on the other side of the bedroom door in a state of helpless alertness that Harriet would tease him about for years. The doctor and Mrs. Kettner, who had appointed herself essential to the proceedings without being asked, and who was in fact indispensable, had managed everything, and when the door had finally opened and Mrs. Kettner had told Isaac he could come in, he had crossed the room and sat beside Harriet on the bed, and looked at the small, extraordinary, astonishingly loud person in her arms with an expression that Harriet stored in the same place in her memory as the expression from their wedding day. They named him James, James Arthur Wren, James for Isaac's father, Arthur for Harriet's grandfather, who had been a precise and decent man whose memory Harriet had always wanted to honor. James came into the world with Isaac's gray eyes and Harriet's particular quality of studying everything with great seriousness, and he was adored with a complete absence of restraint by Thomas Lark, by Mrs. Kettner, by Ada, who held him for a considerable time on his first Sunday outside the house, and said something over him in Cherokee that she did not translate, but that had the feeling of a blessing, and by every person in Caldwell who came to see him in the first weeks. The school was returned to Harriet the following spring when the temporary teacher from Wichita, who had been excellent, left to marry a man in Dodge City. Harriet taught with James in a basket in the corner of the schoolroom for the first part of the spring term, until he was old enough to spend mornings with Mrs. Kettner while she taught, an arrangement that worked seamlessly because Mrs. Kettner had been hoping for exactly this since the moment she first saw Harriet arrive at the boarding house. Doyle Fitch's trial had concluded in the spring of 1884. Isaac had received official notice from the Topeka office with the verdict: guilty on 3 counts of fraud and 2 counts of criminal harassment, sentenced to 4 years in the Kansas State Prison. He had brought the notice to Harriet at the schoolhouse at the end of the school day, when she was straightening the student desks, and James was asleep in his basket in the corner, worn out from several hours of energetic engagement with the world. She had read the notice. Then she had read it again. Then she had set it down on her desk and looked out through the perfectly seated windows at the Caldwell Street and the Kansas sky, and she had been quiet for a long moment. "Is there anything you need to feel about that?" Isaac asked, which was how he asked that particular question. "I feel relieved," she said, "genuinely. And I feel sorry for the part of myself that needed this in order to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. I should have been able to stop waiting without a verdict." "You were carrying it for 2 years before I knew you," he said. "That does not disappear overnight, verdict or not." "No," she said, "but I am going to make a deliberate effort to put it down now." She turned to him. "I think it has been down for a while, actually. I think I just needed the official confirmation." He had come to her side of the desk and kissed her, gently and without hurry, and James had made a small noise in his basket that may or may not have been commentary. The years that followed Harriet and Isaac's first year together moved with the specific rhythm of a life that is being built rather than survived. Caldwell grew with the territory, the Santa Fe line bringing commerce and commotion, and Isaac's work as Marshal grew with it, demanding more of his time but never so much that he was not present for the things that required being present for. He was the kind of father, as Harriet had suspected he would be, who understood that consistency was more important than spectacle, who was on the back step in the evenings and at the Sunday table and available for the small daily negotiations of a child discovering the world. James was 3 when Harriet told Isaac there was going to be another child. This time she told him in the front room in the early evening, and he had responded with somewhat less of the silent pause of the first time and considerably more of the kind of uncomplicated gladness that comes when you have learned to expect good things. The second child was also a boy, and they named him Henry, after no one in particular. because they had agreed in a conversation that meandered pleasantly through several possibilities that Henry was simply a solid and respectable name that suited the kind of person they hoped he would be. Henry arrived with Harriet's dark eyes and a disposition that was, from the earliest weeks, considerably more easygoing than his brother's, which Harriet said was evidence that second children knew what they were coming into. Thomas Lark had been made senior deputy by then, his name well enough established in Caldwell that when Isaac had formally appointed him, there had been no serious objection from anyone who mattered. Thomas's grandmother Ada had arrived at the ceremony in her finest clothing and sat in the front row and said nothing during the entire proceeding, but radiated a satisfaction that Thomas said was more unsettling than any criticism she had ever offered him. Harriet's school had grown. The original one-room building had been expanded twice by 1885, and there were now 2 rooms and a part-time assistant teacher, a young man named Robert Walsh who was fresh from a normal school in Missouri, and who regarded Harriet with the specific combination of respect and nervousness that new teachers directed at experienced ones when the experienced one was evidently excellent at the work. She supervised him with the patience and directness that had characterized her teaching from the beginning, and he became, within a year, someone she trusted to run the classroom without her when necessary. The carpetbag stayed in the wardrobe. Harriet had added things to it over the years. Letters from Isaac that she kept not because she needed to reread them, but because they were a record of a specific kind of love that she wanted her sons to know had existed between their parents. The pressed flower from the spring of 1883 that Isaac had left on her desk one morning for no reason other than that he had passed it on his walk and thought it was the right color. The small drawing James had made at age 4 of their house, in which the house was recognizable as a house only by the most generous interpretation, and which Isaac had asked to keep and then brought home because he said it was clearly a masterpiece. She had thought about the goat in the alley, about the coffee on the small chairs, about the note slipped under the schoolhouse door, about Prairie Light and letters and a sealed envelope that had traveled back and forth between 2 people until one of them stopped being afraid. "What are you thinking about?" Isaac asked, watching her face in the way he had. "The letters," she said. "Which ones?" "The one you kept sending back." She looked at him. "All 9 of them." "8, he said. 9, I counted." He considered this with the slight expression of amusement he reserved for moments when she was right about something he had hoped she wouldn't verify. "Fine. 9. "Why did you not stop?" she said. "I sent it back. I sent it back 9 times. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the prairie going wide and fading in the evening. Then he said, "Because what it said was still true every time I got it back. And because I thought that if I stopped sending it, you might conclude that I had stopped meaning it, which was not something I was willing to let you conclude." She had taken his hand. "I was afraid," she said. "That is the real answer to everything I could not do for 4 months." "I know," he said. "I was afraid, too, that you would keep sending it back, that you would eventually leave Caldwell and I would watch your train leave from the depot and have nothing but the letter." "But I stayed," she said. "You stayed," he said. Winter came again, as it always did, and they were warm. The following years spread out before them in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, because life in Caldwell was never without its complications. Cattle disputes and drought years, and the slow, complicated changes that came as the frontier era gave way to something more settled and more complicated in its own ways. But none of the difficulty touched the center of things, which remained clear and constant. James grew up with his father's directness and his mother's capacity for sustained attention, and by the time he was 8, He was reading everything in the house that would hold still long enough and conducting an ongoing intellectual correspondence with the subject matter of every book he encountered, sometimes aloud, which filled the house with a specific variety of noise that Harriet found entirely delightful. Henry grew up with an ease in the world that was his own invention, not taught by either parent, and a talent for music that arrived unexpectedly in the form of a harmonica that Isaac had brought home from a man who was passing through, and which Henry took to with an absorbed dedication that looked almost meditative. They had a third child in 1889, a girl they named Eleanor Ruth. Eleanor arrived with Harriet's dark eyes and Isaac's gray ones simultaneously, which the doctor said was uncommon, and Harriet said was entirely characteristic of a child of theirs. She arrived already with a personality that seemed to be considering all available options and reserving judgment, which Isaac told Harriet privately made him feel that they were in for an interesting decade. Ada was still alive, still selling herbs from her wagon on the edge of town, still delivering counsel with the bluntness of a woman who had been correct about enough things to have earned the right. She came to see Eleanor within a week of her birth, and held her in the particular careful way she had held James and Henry, and said something over her as she had said something over them, and looked at Harriet with an expression that Harriet had learned over years to read correctly, which was that Ada had determined that things were as they should be. Isaac, in his 40s by the latter part of the decade, was still Marshal of Caldwell and still the most consistently present thing in Harriet's days, still the fixed point around which the house and the school and the children and the wide Kansas days organized themselves. He was not a romantic man in the dramatic sense. He did not write poems or commission paintings or arrive home with armloads of flowers. What he did was sit beside her in the evenings, consistently, without exception, and talk to her as if her thoughts were always worth hearing, and bring her coffee when she was working late on something, and fix things that needed fixing without waiting to be asked, and put his hand on the small of her back when they stood together in any public setting, unconsciously, as if she were simply the place his hand wanted to be. The carpet-bag had been moved to a proper keepsake box by this point, a cedar chest that Harriet kept in the corner of the bedroom. She had organized its contents carefully. The letters, the drawings, the pressed flower, the original note from under the schoolhouse door that had said, "If something is troubling you and you would like to talk, I am a reasonable listener." She had added to it over the years, and she intended to keep adding to it. On a morning in early spring of 1890, she had been standing at the schoolhouse window watching her current students play in the field before the school day began, and she had been thinking about the day 8 years earlier when she had stood on the step of this same building and nearly walked into a Marshal and a disagreeable goat, and she had felt the full arc of it. The woman at the boarding-house door with fear like an architecture, the letters passing back and forth, the burned building and the letters and the man who kept sending them back because what they said was true. She had written a letter that evening, not to anyone outside the house. She had sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed and Isaac was on the back step with his coffee, and she had written a letter to herself, or to the woman who had arrived on the train in 1882, and she had told her that the secret she was carrying would not define her, that the fear was navigable, that the running would end, and that what was waiting on the other side of the walls she had built was worth every brick she had finally put down. She had not sent it anywhere. She had folded it and put it in the cedar chest. Then she had gone to the back step with her own coffee and sat beside Isaac in the early spring dark, and the prairie had been quiet except for the wind, which was always present, and the light from the kitchen window had come out across the step where they sat together, and she had said, "I was thinking about arriving here." He had looked at her, 8 years in April, you counted. I have my own numbers, he said. The day on the train platform is one of them. She had laughed softly. What do you think when you count it? He had considered the prairie for a moment in his particular way, and then he had said, I think I was very fortunate that the goat was there. She had pressed her shoulder against his, and they had sat that way in the spring dark, with the children asleep behind them and the prairie going on in the dark, and the sky enormous and scattered with stars the way the Kansas sky always was in spring, and the warmth of the kitchen coming through the open door, and all the things they had been to each other, and built together, settled around them like something solid and permanent and entirely their own. Isaac Wren put his arm around his wife's shoulders, and she leaned into it, and neither of them spoke for a long time, because they had found long ago that they could do that the silence between them was not empty but full of all the things that words would not improve. The letters were in the cedar chest. The windows did not rattle. The goat, one must assume, was somewhere being a goat, and Harriet Summers, who was Harriet Wren, was home.